The King Tiger was supposed to be the answer. It was supposed to be the steel fist that restored German battlefield dominance. It was supposed to stand above the Sherman, above the T-34, above the Cromwell, and even above the IS series as the final expression of armored warfare. When people picture it today, they usually picture the same thing: a gigantic turret, thick sloped armor, the long 88 gun, a machine that looked less like a tank and more like a moving bunker with a cannon. And that image is exactly why the King Tiger became a legend. It is also why so many people misunderstand it. The question is not whether the Tiger II was formidable. It absolutely was. The real question is why a tank that looked so overpowering arrived too late, in too few numbers, with too many weaknesses, and under conditions Germany could no longer survive. That is where the illusion begins. So let me put a question to you right away, folks. If you were a German planner in 1944, would you rather have one King Tiger or several simpler tanks that were easier to build, fuel, repair, and recover? Tell me in the comments. Throughout this analysis, I am going to stay honest about both sides of the argument. I am not here to worship the machine, and I am not here to dismiss it with lazy myths either. We are going to look at the King Tiger the way a wartime staff officer had to look at it. Not as a poster, not as a museum piece, but as a weapon system inside a collapsing military economy. And if that kind of analysis is your thing, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. To understand why the King Tiger was doomed, you first have to understand what Germany thought it needed. By 1942 and 1943, German armored doctrine was colliding with a new reality. On the Eastern Front, Soviet industry was producing large quantities of T-34s and heavier types in numbers Germany struggled to match. In the West and in the Mediterranean, Anglo-American industry was proving even more frightening in the long run. German planners had already been shocked by the T-34 and the KV series. Their response was not only to improve existing tanks, but to chase overmatch. Better gun, better armor, better optics, better long-range lethality. The Tiger I had already embodied that logic. The Tiger II pushed it further by combining the Tiger concept with more heavily sloped armor inspired by the Panther. On paper, that sounds brilliant. In practice, it created a machine of nearly 70 tons with all the burdens that came with that mass. And this is the first trap in the King Tiger story. People often evaluate tanks by dual logic. Which gun could penetrate which armor at what range? Which crew had the better optics? Which tank would win in a head-on engagement across open ground? That matters, of course. But war is not a clean firing range. A tank has to be manufactured. It has to be transported by rail. It has to cross bridges. It has to reach the battlefield without breaking down. It has to be supplied with fuel and ammunition. It has to be recovered if it throws a track or loses a final drive. It has to be maintained by mechanics who are not magicians. It has to fit into the operational tempo of the army using it. The King Tiger was excellent at terrifying people in the duel phase. It was much less excellent at surviving the entire chain that got it there. Now, let's give the machine its due, because you cannot understand the illusion without understanding the genuine strength underneath it. The Tiger II, officially Panzerkampfwagen Tiger Ausf B, was armed with the 88mm KWK 43L/71. That gun was not propaganda. It was one of the most dangerous tank guns fielded during the war. It offered high muzzle velocity, excellent anti-armor performance, and the kind of long-range lethality that made Allied and Soviet crews extremely cautious. Combined with German optics and good fire control practice, it gave the Tiger II the ability to dominate open lines of sight if the tank was in position, functioning properly, and adequately supplied. In frontal combat, that combination was a serious problem for anyone facing it. Its protection was equally imposing. The production turret front was 180 millimeters thick. The upper glacis was 150 millimeters at a strong slope. Even the lower front was 100 millimeters. The whole design reflected Germany's late war obsession with frontal survivability and long-range firepower. Against many common Allied tank guns, especially in frontal engagements, the Tiger II could be extremely difficult to defeat. This is why it gained such an outsized reputation. If you were in a Sherman, a T-34-85, or even another German tank looking at one from the front, you were not seeing an ordinary opponent. You were seeing a vehicle designed around the idea that frontal defeat should be rare. And in the narrow context of frontal dueling, that design worked. But here comes the problem. A tank is not just a front plate and a gun barrel. It is an engineering compromise. Every millimeter of armor adds weight. Every ton of weight punishes suspension, gearbox, final drives, fuel consumption, transport options, and bridge classification. The King Tiger sat on a chassis pushed close to the practical limit. Its Maybach HL 230 engine produced around 700 horsepower, which sounds respectable until you remember what it had to move. That produced a power-to-weight ratio of roughly 10 horsepower per ton. For a vehicle intended to maneuver in real battlefield conditions, that was not generous. Not with mud, not with damaged roads, not with a collapsing maintenance network, not with Germany running out of everything that kept armored formations moving. And this is where the illusion of armor begins to harden into a military problem. Heavy armor can save you from enemy fire. It cannot save you from your own logistics. Armor can protect against penetration. It cannot reduce fuel consumption. Armor can absorb hits. It cannot magically strengthen an overstressed drivetrain. Once a tank becomes too heavy for the industrial and operational environment around it, its armor starts creating vulnerabilities rather than eliminating them. The Tiger II was the classic case. The very feature that made it famous also helped doom it. Let's talk about development, because this was not an accident in the simple sense. German designers were not fools scribbling giant tanks on napkins. They were trying to solve a battlefield problem using the logic available to them. The Tiger II emerged from efforts to create a successor that improved on the Tiger I while integrating sloped armor principles. The first vehicles used what is commonly called the early or so-called Porsche turret, though Krupp built both turret types. Later production moved to the more familiar production turret with the flatter front and simplified shape. This matters because even the turret history reveals something about the whole project. Germany was introducing a highly complex vehicle while still refining major design elements under wartime pressure. That is not ideal when your strategic position is already deteriorating. The production numbers tell the same story. Only 492 Tiger IIs were completed. One was built in 1943. 379 were produced in 1944. 112 followed in 1945. Those are tiny numbers for a war of industrial attrition. Germany had ordered far more, but Allied bombing heavily disrupted production. According to widely cited figures, raids between late September and early October 1944 devastated the Henschel plant, destroying most of the floor area and causing a major production loss. So even before the tank reaches the battlefield, we already have one part of the answer. The King Tiger was too scarce. A tank can be tactically excellent and still strategically irrelevant if the numbers never match the scale of the war. Now compare that scarcity to what Germany was actually facing. The Allies were not building mythical supertanks. They were building systems of war. Shermans came with spare parts, bridging equipment, transport capacity, massive fuel support, repair organizations, and air superiority overhead. Soviet armored forces came with ruthless standardization, growing operational skill, and industrial depth that Germany could not break. This is the second great illusion surrounding the Tiger II. People compare vehicle to vehicle, but the real contest was system against system. The King Tiger was a masterpiece candidate inside a losing system. Its enemies were often less glamorous, but they belonged to systems that could absorb losses, replace vehicles, repair damage, and keep moving. You can see this even in the simple economics of effort. The Tiger II was the costliest German tank of its time, at over 321,000 Reichsmark, according to standard production figures. Even if we avoid pretending cost alone decides war, the implication is obvious. Germany was pouring scarce labor, materials, transport capacity, and machine time into a vehicle that could only ever appear in small numbers. That might make sense if each vehicle had consistent operational availability and decisive strategic effect. But the Tiger II did not have either. It was powerful, yes. It was not cheap, not simple, and not broadly sustainable. It was a prestige weapon for a military situation that needed resilient mass and reliable mobility more than it needed a steel crown. Now let's get into the mechanics of the problem, because this is where the romantic image really starts to crack. Early Tiger IIs proved unreliable. The documented issues included leaking seals and gaskets, an overburdened drivetrain, manufacturing defects, and failures in the final drives, steering system, track tensioning adjusters, and sprocket wheels. The final drive problem in particular was poisonous because it struck at mobility itself. You can forgive many flaws in a heavy tank. You cannot forgive the inability to move when ordered. Germany had already struggled with mechanical reliability in other armored designs, but in the Tiger II, these issues were especially punishing because the margin for recovery was so thin. A lighter tank that breaks down is a headache. A nearly 70-ton tank that breaks down is a battlefield event. And let's be honest here, there is a kind of late-war German engineering mythology that assumes complexity equals superiority. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes it is just expensive fragility dressed in technical vocabulary. The Tiger II had engineering sophistication, but it also had engineering overstretch. The drivetrain had effectively inherited burdens from design paths that were lighter than the final machine. When the tank was pushed through poor terrain, uneven surfaces, long road marches, or undertrained maintenance conditions, stress accumulated quickly. German reports and later technical discussions consistently point toward the running gear and final drives as major trouble areas. That is not a trivial flaw. That is the difference between an armored threat and a stranded bunker. Fuel was another quiet killer. Official figures gave the Tiger II a road range of around 190 kilometers and a cross-country range around 120 kilometers, with fuel capacity of roughly 860 liters. Those numbers already tell you the appetite of the machine. But by late 1944 and early 1945, Germany's fuel situation had become catastrophic under Allied pressure and the wider effects of the oil campaign. A fuel-hungry heavy tank in an army starved of fuel is like owning a fortress that cannot reach the battlefield. Even when the Tiger II was mechanically functional, the strategic fuel crisis meant its operational freedom was shrinking. Tanks are not judged only by their maximum road speed. They are judged by whether they can still be maneuvered on day 3, day 5, day 10 of a campaign. For Germany, that answer was increasingly no. What about recovery? This is a detail many casual discussions ignore, but military professionals never ignore it. If a tank is damaged, bogged, or mechanically disabled, can you recover it? Can you tow it? Can you repair it in the field? Can you prevent the crew from blowing it up and walking away? German experience with heavy tanks had already shown how difficult this was. Recovery of Tiger family vehicles often required multiple heavy half-tracks or another tank, and even then towing was dangerous and punishing. In practice, disabled heavy tanks were frequently abandoned if proper recovery assets were unavailable, or if the tactical situation was deteriorating. For the Tiger II, that problem was magnified. Every mechanical failure carried the shadow of permanent loss. That means operational attrition did not just come from enemy fire. It came from weight, distance, and the inability to retrieve your own machine. This is why the phrase illusion of armor is so useful. Armor seduces the eye. It creates a psychological certainty. Thicker means safer. Heavier means stronger. Bigger means better. Yet on a real battlefield, armor only protects the vehicle that can appear in the right place at the right time and remain in action. Once the vehicle becomes too rare, too maintenance-heavy, too fuel-sensitive, too difficult to recover, and too fragile in its mobility components, the armor starts functioning like a kind of gilded trap. The King Tiger was not overprotected in the simple sense. It was overcommitted to a concept of battlefield dominance that Germany no longer had the means to support. Now let's compare the Tiger II to the kinds of enemies it was expected to overmatch. Against a Sherman, the King Tiger usually held the advantage in frontal protection and long-range firepower. Against a T-34-85, the same was often true in pure duel conditions. Against many British tanks, again, frontal engagements favored the German heavy. This is why veteran testimony and battlefield memory often sound so dramatic. Seeing a King Tiger from the wrong angle at the wrong distance was a very bad day. But war is not a tournament bracket. Shermans and T-34s could be built in vast numbers. They could be repaired more easily. They moved with larger operational ecosystems behind them. They crossed more bridges. They consumed logistics, but not at the same rate per vehicle burden. They could accept losses that Germany could not. So yes, the Tiger II could often outfight them tactically. That does not mean it could outlast the strategic environment that produced them. Let's also strip away another myth. The Tiger II was not invulnerable. Its frontal armor was formidable, but not magical. Side armor was much thinner. The vehicle could be immobilized, flanked, tracked, bombed, shelled, or struck under conditions that bypassed the ideal frontal duel. Terrain mattered. Crew quality mattered, ammunition type mattered, tactical surprise mattered, mechanical condition mattered. Soviet forces, British forces, and American forces all learned, in different ways, to handle the heavy German tanks not by indulging in dramatic one-on-one fantasies, but by combining maneuver, artillery, air power, anti-tank guns, and attritional pressure. The King Tiger could punish frontal stupidity. It could not rewrite the combined arms battlefield of 1944 and 1945. Its first combat use in Normandy is a telling case. The Tiger II entered action with the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion in July 1944 during the fighting around Caen. On paper, this was exactly the sort of battlefield where a powerful heavy tank might make a dramatic impression. In reality, Normandy was a nightmare of Allied artillery, air attack, cratered roads, constrained movement, and relentless operational pressure. Some Tiger IIs were lost in combat. Others were trapped or disabled in conditions where extraction became impossible. The point here is not that the tank was useless. It was dangerous. The point is that the environment was already punishing every weakness the design possessed. The battlefield was not cooperating with the myth. And the same pattern appears on the Eastern Front. The 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion received Tiger IIs and committed them in August 1944 against Soviet forces near the Vistula bridgehead. Again, the vehicle's firepower and armor were real. Again, the wider conditions were deadly. In the fighting near Oglendo, Tiger IIs were ambushed and destroyed by T-34-85s. Some were captured intact. The significance goes beyond the local action. It shows that even this formidable machine could be defeated by tactical surprise, operational confusion, and the brutal realities of combat in depth. A tank designed to dominate from the front was still vulnerable once the battlefield stopped behaving like a brochure. There is also a human dimension here that often gets lost when people reduce tanks to armor thickness charts. German crews were frequently brave, experienced, and tactically skilled, but by late war, the training pipeline, maintenance support, and strategic context were all deteriorating. A complicated vehicle demands competent crews and competent support. When both quality and time are shrinking, the burden of complexity rises. The best crews could wring extraordinary performance out of the Tiger II. The average situation was harsher. Spare parts shortages, fuel shortages, hasty deployments, and mounting Allied pressure meant that even skilled crews often operated under conditions where the tank's theoretical capability could not fully emerge. In other words, the Tiger II needed excellence around it. Germany could no longer provide excellence at scale. And that brings us to the core strategic contradiction. The King Tiger was a late-war answer to a question Germany could no longer afford to ask. If your war economy is under bombing pressure, if your fuel supply is collapsing, if your heavy battalions are losing experienced men, if your rail and bridge networks are under stress, if your enemy has artillery superiority, growing air superiority, and numerical mass, then what exactly are you buying with extreme frontal armor and a superb gun? You are buying local intimidation. You are buying occasional tactical brilliance. You are buying battlefield legend. But you are not buying operational freedom or strategic recovery. And that is why the King Tiger was doomed, not because it was weak, but because it was strong in the wrong way for the war Germany was actually fighting by 1944. So the verdict for Part 1 is this. The King Tiger was not a fraud. It was not a joke. It was not just Nazi propaganda on tracks. It was a genuinely fearsome heavy tank with immense firepower and exceptional frontal protection. But its power was wrapped inside a design and a strategic context that amplified every weakness. It was too heavy for reliability margins Germany could sustain, too expensive for the numbers Germany needed, too fuel-hungry for the supply reality of late war. too difficult to recover when disabled, too dependent on conditions that were disappearing. The illusion was not that the armor was fake. The illusion was that armor alone could still solve Germany's battlefield problem. In the next part, we will go deeper into how the Tiger II actually fought, where it succeeded, where it failed, and why tactical fear did not translate into strategic effect. And that gap between tactical terror and strategic value is where the battlefield story becomes really important. A tank can be feared and still fail. A tank can win local engagements and still lose the campaign around it. In fact, that is almost the defining feature of the King Tiger. It often imposed respect far beyond its actual numbers. But respect is not the same thing as operational effect. The Tiger II was built for decisive, armored confrontations. By the time it entered combat in meaningful numbers, Germany was increasingly fighting a defensive war shaped by shortages, air attack, artillery concentration, broken movement corridors, and shrinking room for maneuver. That was a very bad environment for a machine whose strengths depended on controlled positioning, long sight lines, stable support, and functioning logistics. So how did the King Tiger actually perform when all of those conditions collided? Let us begin with the simplest point. When it was well handled, stationary or moving carefully, and able to engage at range, it could be devastating. Its gun gave it the ability to kill enemy tanks before they could reliably answer from the front. Its frontal armor gave crews confidence in duel situations, and that confidence mattered. A crew that believes its tank can survive the first exchange often shoots calmer and faster. German optics and gunnery standards helped too. In a defensive ambush, in a hull-down position, or on open ground with fields of fire, the Tiger II was exactly what its designers wanted it to be. It was an anti-tank predator with bunker-like frontal protection. But what happened when it had to attack? What happened when it had to redeploy across poor roads, pass through villages, negotiate soft ground, or maintain pace with a larger formation? This is where the machine's logic began to fall apart. Heavy tanks rarely fail in glamorous ways. They fail in ways that logisticians understand instantly and enthusiasts prefer not to talk about. A transmission overheats. A final drive fails. A track is thrown under lateral stress. A bridge cannot support the load. A rail movement becomes awkward. A bogged vehicle cannot be recovered under fire. A fuel state forces a detour or an abandonment. And because the Tiger II weighed close to 70 tons, every one of those problems became more serious than it would have been for a lighter vehicle. That is why the first large combat experiences are so revealing. When the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion received Tiger IIs and moved towards southeastern Poland in August 1944, the battalion did not arrive as some unstoppable steel thunderbolt. Many of its tanks reportedly suffered final drive breakdowns during a relatively short road march after detraining. That detail is absolutely crucial. Before we even get to enemy action, the tank is already paying interest on its own weight and complexity. So when people ask why the King Tiger was doomed, one answer is brutally simple. It was entering battle already tired by design. Then came Oglendów and the fighting around the Soviet bridgehead near the Vistula. This has become one of the most instructive episodes in the Tiger II story because it shows how a terrifying vehicle can still be vulnerable when tactical conditions turn against it. On the road to Oglendów, Tiger IIs of the 501st encountered a Soviet ambush. Several were destroyed by T-34-85s attacking from favorable positions. Soviet accounts and later summaries also describe combined pressure from artillery, self-propelled guns, and flanking attacks in terrain that was unfavorable for the heavy Germans. Up to 14 Tiger IIs of the battalion were destroyed or captured in the area over several days, and the Soviets obtained operational examples for testing. In pure mythology, that should not happen. In real war, it happened because no tank is immune to surprise, angle, terrain, and operational disorder. And notice what that battle tells you beyond the kill count. The Tiger II was designed around frontal overmatch. The Soviets answered by refusing the frontal script. They used concealment, side shots, supporting arms, and local initiative. That is how professional armies deal with superior hardware. They do not line up politely and admire it. They look for the angle that turns the enemy's greatest strength into a rigid weakness. Heavy armor is wonderful until the fight stops being frontal. A long gun is wonderful until visibility, terrain, or surprise cuts the range. A big tank is wonderful until it needs to move fast in bad ground, and everything around it becomes a tax. There is another detail from that fighting that deserves attention: the ammunition stowage issue. Reports associated with the early combat losses noted catastrophic ammunition explosions, which contributed to heavy crew casualties. As a consequence, main gun rounds were no longer allowed to be stored in the turret, reducing carried ammunition. That tells us something important about late-war adaptation. Germany was still discovering practical limits in combat while already under intense operational pressure. The Tiger II was not a mature, settled, effortless weapon. It was a dangerous system still being adjusted in war, inside an army that had less and less margin for learning by pain. Now move west to Normandy. Again, the pattern repeats. The first combat use of the Tiger II took place with the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion during fighting linked to Operation Atlantic in July 1944 in the wider Caen battles. Normandy should have been a warning label attached directly to the Tiger II concept. Dense hedgerow country in many sectors, cratered roads, artillery saturation, Allied fighter bombers overhead, choke points everywhere, recovery nightmares, limited room to exploit long-range gunnery. This was not the clean, armored battlefield of German dreams. It was an industrialized killing ground where every ton had to justify itself. Some Tiger IIs were lost in combat. One vehicle became irrecoverably trapped after falling into a bomb crater. There, in one image, is the King Tiger problem in miniature. Massive protection, massive gun, completely defeated by the environment of late war. That is why I keep using the phrase, illusion of armor. Armor invites people to think in terms of direct protection only, but armor has a shadow cost. The more armor you add, the more you burden movement, production, maintenance, bridging, rail transport, and fuel use. At some point, you are not simply increasing survivability. You are shifting vulnerability into places people do not instinctively see. The King Tiger was not vulnerable because its armor was thin. It was vulnerable because its armor made so many other things harder that the enemy could attack the system rather than the plate. Then we arrive at the Ardennes, where the Tiger II has one of its most famous and most misunderstood moments. The Battle of the Bulge is often presented in dramatic cinematic terms: snow, forest roads, elite units, desperate American defense, German heavy armor grinding westward. And yes, the King Tiger featured in that story. Units such as the 506th Heavy Panzer Battalion had re-equipped with Tiger IIs in late summer 1944. During the Ardennes offensive, Tiger IIs and other heavy armored vehicles were part of a larger gamble that depended on speed, road access, surprise, and fuel. Those are exactly the things the Tiger II consumed in painful quantities. This is one of the bitter ironies of the tank's career. Germany launched an offensive that required operational agility and fuel discipline, while committing some of the least forgiving vehicles imaginable. Once the offensive jammed on narrow roads, once bridges and routes became contested, once American resistance hardened, once fuel difficulties mounted, the heavy German spearheads began to suffer from the very constraints that their own mass intensified. The Tiger II could smash through a local position. It could also clog a route, strain the advance, and become a catastrophic loss if disabled where recovery was impossible. The episode around La Glaise and Kampfgruppe Piper is one of the clearest symbolic endings to the whole illusion. Piper's force advanced aggressively, but became increasingly isolated and constrained by road conditions, resistance, and fuel problems. By the time the German spearhead was trapped around La Glaise, the offensive momentum that was supposed to redeem these heavy armored assets had evaporated. A surviving King Tiger still stands there as a monument to that failure. Contemporary local and historical sources connected to the battlefield record that Piper's trapped force abandoned a very large number of vehicles when it withdrew on Christmas Eve. The tank preserved at La Glaise is famous precisely because it is both impressive and abandoned. That is almost too perfect as a metaphor. The machine still looks dominant. The campaign around it had already collapsed. And this is the part enthusiasts sometimes resist. Abandonment is not a footnote. It is a battlefield verdict. A tank that has to be left behind because it cannot be recovered, fueled, or evacuated is not merely unlucky. It is telling you something about the doctrine that produced it. The Tiger II was so burdensome that defeat often arrived not as dramatic armor penetration from the front, but as immobilization, followed by demolition charges and a walking crew. In other words, the tank often died because Germany could no longer carry its own solution. The same broader lesson appears in Hungary. Tiger IIs of the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion fought there during late 1944, including operations tied to Budapest and Debrecen. These actions are useful because they show that, under some circumstances, the King Tiger could still inflict notable losses and serve as an effective heavy striking asset. Records commonly cited for the battalion credit it with large numbers of enemy vehicles and guns during its prolonged time in the Hungarian theater. But even here, the balance sheet remains revealing. Alongside claimed battlefield success came the loss of Tiger IIs to enemy action, mechanical causes, and scuttling by their own crews. That is the recurring Tiger II pattern: tactical lethality, operational friction, strategic insufficiency. Now let us zoom in from campaigns to pure tactics. What was the best way to use a King Tiger? Ideally, you wanted it where its front faced the enemy, where its gun had room to work, where the flanks were protected, and where terrain did not demand violent maneuvering. In defensive sectors, at standoff range, or in deliberately planned counterattacks, it could be formidable. In villages, forests, broken terrain, muddy approaches, urban edges, and hasty advances, its problems multiplied. This is not unusual for heavy armor, but the Tiger II magnified the rule because the cost of every mistake was so high. A medium tank making a bad turn might still be salvageable. A Tiger II making a bad turn in bad ground might become a permanent feature of the landscape. Another issue was tempo. Medium tanks can absorb a certain amount of disorder because they are easier to move, hide, fuel, and recover. The Tiger II wanted preparation. It wanted competent route planning. It wanted engineers to think about bridges. It wanted maintenance crews with the right parts. It wanted fuel planners who were not staring into the abyss. But Germany in late 1944 and early 1945 was living in the abyss. Rail disruption, bombing, shortages, front collapses, improvised formations, and uneven crew quality all punished a design that demanded careful orchestration. The machine was not operating in the Wehrmacht of 1940. It was operating in the exhaustion of 1944. And that brings us to the industrial question, which is really the biggest one of all. Why build a tank like this when simpler alternatives existed? Germany believed qualitative superiority could offset quantitative inferiority. That logic had worked often enough in local tactical terms to become a kind of habit. Better optics, better gun, better armor, fewer tanks but better tanks. The problem is that this formula gets more dangerous as the war becomes more industrial and attritional. By 1944, Germany was not trying to win a series of elegant duels. It was trying to survive massed Allied and Soviet pressure in land, air, production, and fuel. In that environment, adding excellence to each individual tank did not automatically create a better force. Sometimes it created a smaller, more brittle one. Look at the production count again in that light. Fewer than 500 Tiger IIs were completed. That is not enough to shape a continental war unless each vehicle has extraordinary availability and is embedded in a functioning military system. It had neither advantage at the required scale. Meanwhile, the Allies and the Soviets fielded enormous numbers of vehicles that were not individually as intimidating from the front, but were good enough, replaceable, maintainable, and available in concentrations Germany could not match. This is one of the hardest truths in military history. The side with the better-looking weapon is not always the side with the better war. And here I want to push back against two lazy interpretations at once. The first lazy interpretation says the King Tiger was a useless monster that did nothing well. That is wrong. It was a serious battlefield threat with excellent anti-tank capability and very strong frontal protection. Allied and Soviet crews did not imagine that threat. They respected it for good reason. The second lazy interpretation says it was a wonder weapon betrayed only by fuel shortages and bad luck. That is also wrong. Fuel shortages mattered enormously, yes, but the tank's own design burden, reliability issues, transport difficulty, and recovery problems were not bad luck. They were structural consequences of the concept itself. So was the King Tiger a tactical success? Sometimes yes. Was it an operational success? Usually not. Was it a strategic success? No. And that three-level distinction matters a great deal. Tactical success means you can destroy enemy vehicles and hold or contest ground in local engagements. Operational success means you can sustain movement and shape campaigns across time and space. Strategic success means your weapon supports the overall war effort efficiently enough to matter. The Tiger II could check the first box in the right conditions. It usually struggled with the second. It did not solve the third. There is also a wider doctrinal lesson that goes beyond the Second World War. Militaries are often tempted by the visible metric: thickest armor, biggest gun, highest speed, longest range. But battlefields punish one-dimensional thinking. A weapon is only as good as the doctrine, industry, training, maintenance, and logistics that keep it useful. If one attribute becomes so dominant that it quietly sabotages the rest, the weapon can become an expensive trap. The Tiger II teaches that lesson with almost cruel clarity. Its armor was not fake. Its reputation was not invented. The illusion was believing that enough frontal invulnerability could compensate for systemic decline. It could not. Let me put it another way. The King Tiger was the kind of machine a state builds when it still believes battlefield excellence can reverse strategic gravity. But by 1944, strategic gravity was already pulling Germany downward in fuel, production, transport, crew quality, and air exposure. The Tiger II did not reverse that gravity. It made one corner of the battlefield feel heavier. That is not the same thing. And when the war closed in, the tank's greatest feature became part of its ruin. The armor that made it feared also made it heavy. The heaviness that made it imposing also made it fragile in movement. The gun that made it dominant at range did not help when the machine was stranded, short of fuel, or abandoned by necessity. That is why, when you study photographs of abandoned King Tigers, you are not just looking at destroyed equipment. You are looking at a concept being judged by war itself. Here is the machine that was supposed to overmatch everything in front of it, and there it sits by a roadside, or in a village, or in a field, because the real enemy turned out to be larger than the opposing tank across the gun sight. The real enemy was the total system of modern war. The Allies and the Soviets fought that war with factories, fuel, artillery, engineering, rail movement, recovery assets, replacement crews, and air power. Germany answered too often with brilliance concentrated into machines it could not sustain. So why was the King Tiger doomed? Because it arrived at the intersection of technical ambition and strategic exhaustion. Because it embodied the false hope that you can armor your way out of industrial inferiority. Because it asked too much of an army that could no longer feed, move, repair, and recover it consistently. Because its battlefield virtues were real, but too narrow for the scale of the crisis around it. Because war is not won by the most intimidating silhouette. It is won by the side that can keep fighting effectively after the first impressive contact has passed. And that, folks, is the final verdict. The King Tiger was not doomed because it was weak. It was doomed because it was magnificent in the wrong direction. It perfected a form of armored power that no longer matched the reality of Germany's war. It was a fortress asked to behave like a maneuver weapon. It was a technical masterpiece candidate deployed inside a logistical disaster. It was feared in the moment and defeated in the aggregate. That is the illusion of armor explained. Not that armor does nothing, but that armor alone, no matter how thick, cannot rescue a failing system. In warfare, the most dangerous mistake is often confusing what looks invincible with what is actually sustainable. The King Tiger reminds us that strength without balance becomes burden, and burden in war becomes fate. So let me leave you with this final question. What doomed the King Tiger more? A. Mechanical fragility. B. Fuel and logistics collapse. C. A flawed strategic belief that heavy superiority could replace system-wide resilience. Share your choice in the comments and tell me why you picked it.